Welcome to this week's edition of Outdoors Online, a weekly webcast produced by the North Dakota Game and Fish Department. I'm your host, Tom Jensen. Waterfowl seasons are just around the corner. That's what we're going to talk about today. My guest is head waterfowl biologist Mike Szymanski. Mike, actually, we've got one waterfowl season that's just ending.
Yeah, Tom, the early goose season is just wrapping up here, and it's been a little interesting, I guess. Yeah, we just wrapped up that month-long endeavor here.
Yeah, I'm sure you probably haven't had a chance to look at any of the data from the season yet, but what have you heard anecdotally as far as geese being around?
Sure, we aren't going to have any kind of real harvest data for many months yet on that season, between getting it and then compiling it. But yeah, it was an interesting year. We had a lot of hopes for good harvest with there being a lot of small grain fields out, but we ran into a lot of hot weather. I don't think people were terribly enthusiastic about going out in that. It cooled down a little bit later, and I think people got out and did pretty well, but we also saw some pretty big movements of geese where areas that previously had a lot of birds were somewhat devoid, and people were definitely noticing that. We had, I know we had some birds from Minnesota actually showing up in band recoveries in the state too, so I think for whatever reason the birds were moving around quite a bit more during their late summer movements this year, and that was affecting how people were able to find them.
Waterfowl hunters always keep an eye on the duck numbers. They want big duck numbers. And in order to have big duck numbers, you've got to have good nesting habitat. How does that look?
We've lost a lot of habitat in the state. We're not, I don't think, anywhere near rock bottom yet. But the future doesn't necessarily look all that great. But yeah, we've definitely lost a lot of habitat, and things were all right this year. We got pretty lucky again with water. Coming up through April and out of winter especially, we really didn't have much snow this winter. But then coming through April and really having a dry April, we were drying up quite a bit. And that mixed with not much water was looking like things were going to be a little rough for breeding waterfowl in North Dakota, but we got a ton of rain over about a 7 or 8 week period in May and June, and that created some opportunities, I guess, for ducks, and it hit some of the later breeding species pretty good.
How are the water conditions across the prairie and the Coteau?
Well, it's funny you bring that up, because we've, coming out of winter, like I said, we were pretty rough looking, and then all of a sudden we got all that rain, and we were looking really good across almost the whole state, and as soon as it came, it turned off, and we really haven't had a whole lot since mid-July. We've had a couple of big events, but it's drying up quite a bit, and we're just getting ready to do our fall wetland survey here this week.
Okay. What some people might not understand, Mike, is that duck nesting habitat isn't necessarily water. A lot of it is prevalent on CRP, good ground cover, right?
Yeah, and you need to have both. You need to have the water first, because ducks won't do their whole breeding effort without it, and they won't settle and set up territories without the water. But then you need to have the big blocks of grass that are somewhat close to the water, mallards and gadwalls and pintails. They'll actually nest quite a ways from water, even like a mile away, but they still have to have the water to take their broods to, and smaller water is generally better than bigger water. Big lakes that we see, with boat ramps now are generally not the places where ducks take their broods to grow them up. They need smaller, secluded waters with heavy invertebrate forage bases.
We mentioned that waterfowl hunters enjoy the big duck numbers, so how are they?
It's not looking too bad. When you look at a year-to-year comparison, there was definitely a big drop from last year, but in retrospect, last year was a pretty huge number. So if you look back to previous years and compare, we're very similar to 2013's fall flight estimate, along with much of the 2000s. And I mean, those are still way, way above what we had, prior to our, wet cycle starting in the mid-90s.
North Dakota is known as the duck factory of North America, of course, but a lot of the migration, of course, comes down through Manitoba and Saskatchewan. And they, of course, need water conditions up there to produce a lot of ducks and waterfowl. How are the conditions up there?
Yeah, I think conditions primarily in Saskatchewan, where we get most of our ducks, as far as migration goes, was pretty good. They had decent water coming out of winter. It wasn't super wet, but they had decent production. And then now it looks like they've actually gotten quite wet in the last, where we went dry, they got wet. I think maybe the precipitation just kind of moved north on us is what happened. And I don't know if that's going to affect how they hold birds. They probably will be able to hold birds pretty well, but you never know. That could also turn into some kind of more wintry conditions earlier, which would certainly help us, as long as we don't get it at the same time.
Let's talk rules and regulations, Mike. Any changes to the limits and possession limits this year?
We're sitting pretty good, Tom. We've got about as liberal seasons that you could ever have or have ever had, especially since the treaty went into place. We did liberalize a couple things this year. We had some opportunities to add another white front to the daily bag limit, and that's recognizing that we're not a big white front state. We're pretty much flyby territory for those birds, but we do have a few stop and a few unusual circumstances throughout the state. But we did take that opportunity to add another bird to the bag. And then also with canvasbacks, we have a situation where, based on their breeding population and habitat conditions across their breeding range, it looks like they can support having a second bird in the daily bag. So the bag limit on canvasbacks was increased to 2 again this year.
Any other regulation changes people need to be aware of?
No, that's really it. We're sitting pretty good this year.
All right, Mike, thanks.
Thank you, Tom.
Make sure you read the Waterfowl Proclamation thoroughly and understand the daily and possession limits for ducks and geese. Also familiarize yourself with all the rules and regulations concerning the hunting of ducks and geese and other water birds in North Dakota. Also make sure you're properly licensed to hunt waterfowl. You need a general game and habitat license, a certificate, and waterfowl licenses. Plus, you must have a federal waterfowl stamp, which is now available electronically through the Game and Fish Department's website at gf.nd.gov, and you must be HIP certified to hunt waterfowl in North Dakota. For Mike Szymanski and the rest of the staff here at North Dakota Game and Fish, thanks for joining us. For Outdoors Online, we'll see you again next week.